My name is Carolyn Jones. I'm the Director of the Institute of Employment Rights, and I'd like to welcome you all here today. I think the numbers registered reflect the importance and the timing of this discussion. At IER, we've been highlighting the weaknesses in UK laws and enforcement mechanisms for many years, but it's taken a virulent pandemic to bring the crisis that is our health and safety system to the fore of the political and public agenda. Excuse me. And I say to the fore, but while the public health has gained attention and a fair degree of public money, the government solutions and our regulatory system have in many ways failed to deliver. We could, for instance, discuss yesterday's report from the Public Accounts Committee on the millions wasted on test and trace, or the legal case brought against the government over its lack of transparency in its procurement policy, or the fact that the UK has one of the highest death rates during this COVID pandemic. But today, the failures we want to address focus on four core themes, and they are the failure of UK labour law to protect workers, the failure of the government to ensure employers take the actions necessary to protect workers, the failure of the HSE to do its job in holding the government and employers to account by ensuring they fulfil their duty of care, and the failure of both the government and the HSE to listen to the voice and embrace the expertise of the 100,000 trade union health and safety reps who promote workplace safety on a daily basis. Over the last year, it's become abundantly clear that workers' rights are a public health issue, and ignoring one endangers the other. So, on the anniversary of the announcement of the coronavirus pandemic, IER are proud to launch our report, HSE and Covid at Work, a case of regulatory failure. And we are extremely grateful to the team of experts, many of whom are here with us today, who have joined us in this project and given generously of their time and knowledge to inform this work. This report, I should say, is envisaged as just step one in an IER project aimed at reviewing the whole structure of health and safety law, regulations and enforcement mechanisms. As many of you know, our current laws are based on the recommendations of a committee that met nearly 50 years ago. Since then, the nature of work, the workplace and work patterns have dramatically changed, and COVID has helped expose how inadequate our current system is in dealing with those changes. So the first recommendation in our report is for a major independent public inquiry into the future of health and safety regulation in the UK. I could go on, but I won't, partly because my voice is going, but mainly because I'm surrounded by a panel of people who live and breathe health and safety issues. So I'm very pleased to invite Andy McDonald to say a few words. Andy, as you will know, is Shadow Employment Rights and Protections Minister, and he has been at the forefront of arguing the case for stronger employment protections and radical changes to our enforcement mechanisms. So Andy, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Kat, and thanks for the invitation to join you. It's always a pleasure to speak at an IER event, and I very much welcome this timely, informative and authoritative publication. My only complaint, Kat, is I'm yet to get my hands on a hard copy, so I'm looking forward to that. But COVID and the consequences of the virus for our workplaces is literally of critical importance. And in my role as Shadow Secretary of State for Employment Rights and Protections, it's clear to me that the impact of the pandemic hasn't caused these weaknesses, but it's revealed the fundamental weaknesses in UK labour law in protecting working people. And those failures have left workers very badly exposed. So in addition to preventable deaths, a high proportion of those who've contracted the virus now suffer long COVID symptoms, and millions of workers have experienced work-related stress, depression or anxiety. And the sad reality is that the UK's existing enforcement system is wholly inadequate, and there's a clear need for action to address the flaws of labour market enforcement in the UK, and that is why this document is so important. And not only does it set out in a readily accessible format the relevant regulations that apply, and if they were properly implemented, would mitigate the risks that workers run, but it also pulls no punches in talking about the lost opportunities. And as you rightly say, Kat, we had that opportunity. The offer was made around a National Recovery Council that would have assisted us going forward, but around the 100,000 health and safety reps that are there throughout all sectors and available. I've made the case on innumerable occasions. That is the true partnership working opportunity that has been missed, and I bitterly regret that. I applaud the work that the IER have done around workplace oversight and enforcement. This is going to be of critical importance in the future, and as well, you set out with such clarity the lessons that are going to have to be learned as we go forward. So I'm not going to say too much more, Kat, because I'm looking forward to the contributions from the experts who put this wonderful document together. But rest assured, I so recommend this to anybody who's interested in this area of work. It is an invaluable document, and please rest assured that when I get hold of my copy, it's not going to be far from my side. I've only read it twice online. I'm looking forward to digesting it further. But I just want to thank everybody for going to the trouble of harnessing all of this, because it's an absolutely superb resource, but it also tells us about the issues that we've got to face going forward. And you're absolutely right when you talk about the fundamental review of health and safety and enforcement that's needed. It's been laid bare by this pandemic. You will know the work that we've done around, for example, the classification of COVID opposite it being deemed a significant disease rather than serious. That's a huge issue for us, and we continue to chip away. I'm just sad that we have to do so much digging to get hold of the correct information to tell us what on earth is going on in our health and safety executive. But we're not stopping. We carry on. But many thanks for this. It's a wonderful piece of work, and I wish you every success with it. And I encourage everybody to read it.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for your recommendation. I promise we'll put a few copies in the post to you and your team, so you can have your own marked up copy. Thanks very much for that. I'm going to move swiftly on. Our next speaker is Janet Newsham. Janet not only brings herself, but she also brings the full force of the wonderful organisation that she fronts, which is Hazards, campaigning organisation that has been campaigning for years on the issues of health and safety and enforcement mechanisms in work. Janet is going to talk to us about COVID in the workplace. So Janet, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm speaking on behalf of Professor Phil Taylor from Strathclyde University and Professor Andrew Watterson from Stirling University to introduce the chapter on COVID in the workplace, and from this excellent initiative by the Institute of Employment Rights. I want to begin by asking, was the action of our government and the HSE to the pandemic inevitable, deliberate or misguided? And subsequently, were workers placed at unnecessary risk, leading to higher transmission of the virus, higher infections and higher deaths? A more deadly outcome was always avoidable. The chapter starts by exploring the origins of SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, which we argue was a man-made pandemic caused by the uses and abuses of our environment, expanding food markets and food production methods and supply chains. And then when the virus emerged, it was allowed to rampage globally by an inadequate response made by global capitalism, producing misinformation and inaccurate guidance. But not all countries had the same response, and in many countries, their infections and death rates are substantially lower than the UK. It was clear to us from the start that start of the pandemic, workplaces were a real route of transmission, a vector of transmission, as was said, and that it was an occupational health crisis as well as a public health crisis. And by not recognising this has led to the deaths of thousands of workers, their family members and their communities. The UK's response has been blinded by neoliberal dogma, getting Brexit done at any cost, including human life, and keeping the economy going at any expense. But that expense didn't include taking a precautionary approach to the transmission of the virus or controlling the risks for workers, but rather in giving out handouts to the private sector in contracts and the protection of capitalist markets at its core. The initial response to the virus transmission only recognised direct, indirect and large droplet transmission, which would be contained by cleaning, hygiene and distance. It proved to be dangerously inadequate response to the transmission. On this basis, PPE standards were reduced, although this covered up the government's inadequate supplies for health workers based on their lack of preparation for the inevitable event. It also led to infections of workers in care and health, and inevitably many deaths and long-term ill health of both workers and patients and residents they cared for. There were failings internationally as well, who didn't change their advice on transmission modes for the first 6 months, even though the evidence was in abundance. This lack of a precautionary approach to the risk failed to stop transmission. It was clear from the emerging pandemic evidence and from the many experts around the world that this was an airborne virus, and aerosols could spread far greater than 2 meters and remain suspended like smoke for many hours. There was also evidence of outdoor spread. The UK government's response throughout the pandemic has failed to control the transmission in workplaces. They've failed to provide the advice needed to enforce health and safety laws. The HSE took a back seat, placed public health authority to lead in workplaces, and the risks continued to not be controlled. Government guidance has provided employers unwilling to take necessary precautions with cover to continue to put people's lives at risk. This was a political choice and not a mistake. The ILO and WHO early in the pandemic provided information which reinforced the long-standing tried and tested measures that were needed to control the risks of transmission through risk assessments, alongside action taken by public health bodies to control community transmission through testing, tracing and accurate recording and reporting of cases. But this advice wasn't followed, and it was ignored by our government and its advisors. Workers' exposure to the virus has demonstrated graphically the lack of control measures in workplaces instead of using control hierarchy. So where there's an infection, a risk of infection, stop the activity if it isn't necessary. And if it is, do it in a different way to stop the risk, working from home, working remotely, introducing engineering controls like improved ventilation or isolating workers from the risk, introducing administrative controls like removing touch points, reducing numbers of workers, introducing 2 meter distancing at least, improving cleaning hygiene, and finally, providing a proper standard of PPE for mitigation against the residual risks. It was clear none of this was happening in many workplaces. Those working in environments with highly infected people were not protected with all these mitigations, including PPE. Healthcare settings, but also bus drivers, security guards, and it has disproportionately impacted, as we know, on Black workers, which has highlighted the social inequalities in our society. And many workplace clusters haven't even been documented by Public Health England. The transmission modes not investigated, or the information that could have protected other workers in different settings not shared. As the chapter says, workplace clusters demonstrate widespread failures to control risks of airborne and surface transmission. The government and its advisors have been deaf to the pleas of trade unions, the NGOs, researchers, and professional bodies to follow a strategy that would protect people, one that would save lives. The precautionary approach that is at the heart of our health and safety regulations needed to be enforced, and the recognition and identification of the risks in our workplaces. And we needed investigation and action to protect workers. And we needed employers to report infections, near misses, and deaths. The global view of the pandemic has shown systemic failures to protect vulnerable and essential workers in many countries, notably the meat processing plants in Germany and the US and the UK. And workplaces have become the epicenter of community outbreaks, but also in clothing sectors in Leicester, the call centres in Cardiff. All these were inevitable given the lack of enforcement of control of the risks being faced. Universities, schools, food processing, hospitality, and a reminder that workers' health is public health, and both needed to be protected and the risks controlled. And finally, this government, its occupational health and safety enforcement bodies, its public health bodies, all have to answer to the continued failure to protect workers, their families and their communities. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Janet, and thanks for all the work that you and your colleagues did on that chapter, digging down into some of the COVID hotspots that we've seen around the country. I know that work's been going on and continues to go on, looking at places like DVLA and others. So thanks very much for that. I'll move swiftly on to our next speaker, who is John Hendy. John is going to look at the chapter on health and safety law and the failure of the HSE to implement it at work. So John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Cad. COVID-19, of course, is a public health issue, as Janet has explained, but it's also an industrial disease. And we know that because of the statistics published by Public Health England and the Office for National Statistics, which shows that particular occupations, as Janet explained, have a much higher risk of incidence than people who are not working in those occupations. So it's an industrial disease, and the law has got a lot to say about industrial accidents, industrial diseases and industrial deaths. Now's not the time to review all that law, but I'll just mention some of the things which are particularly relevant to COVID-19. There's what the lawyers call the common law of negligence, which imposes on employers a duty to keep a safe place of work. And in addition to that, which is very long-standing, hundreds of years, judge-made law, in addition to that, there are statutory regulations which are very relevant. Statutory regulations requiring employers to maintain a safe place of work, safe access to work, to provide washing facilities, to require risk assessments to be made where there are known risks, to provide personal protective equipment, and to report industrial diseases and dangerous occurrences. Regulations on all those things. In addition, there is a provision which entitles workers, when faced with what they believe to be serious and imminent danger, to refuse to work. And there are also laws about safety representatives and safety committees. One of the problems, however, is this, that those regulations, or breach of those regulations, is a criminal offence. But that the right to, or the power to prosecute those offences or to serve improvement or prohibition notices rests with the HSE only. Workers don't have that power. That's one of the defects of our law. And indeed, in 2013, the then coalition government removed from workers the power even to rely on regulations in order to claim damages. They took away any civil enforcement of those regulations. And that means also that workers, through their trade unions, could not apply for injunctions to compel employers through a court order to comply with the law. So it means that reliance has to be placed on the health and safety executive, and this poses problems. My colleagues will explain about the enforcement powers and the way that they've been used by the HSE, or not used, as the case in fact is. But I just want to mention this about the HSE. The HSE produces guidance, as one would expect. It is the safety regulator of the United Kingdom for work issues. It produces guidance, but the guidance that was produced in relation to COVID-19 makes no reference to the legal duties that I've touched on just now. One would have expected the guidance to have reminded employers of what their obligations are under the law, particularly bearing in mind that those obligations are matters of criminal law as well. And likewise to have reminded workers that they have rights to safe place of work and so on under the regulations, but no mention made of it. And there are other defects as well in that guidance. For example, in relation to personal protective equipment, face coverings, and so on, the suggestion is made in all those pieces of guidance, I think there are 9 of them, that personal protective equipment is not required for COVID-19 except in clinical situations. In other words, for doctors and nurses treating patients in clinics or hospitals. Now that is clearly ridiculous, given that there are other regulations which have been passed by Parliament which require everybody on public transport to wear a face mask, given that the advice to children returning to school this week is to wear face masks, and yet the guidance for people at work is that face masks are not required except in clinical sessions. And the other issue that I wanted to raise, Cad, if I may, before I stop, in relation to the guidance is this, that as Janet mentioned, we now know that the main means of transmission of this disease is by aerosol, by, as Janet described it, like smoke hanging in the atmosphere. That requires employers to make a risk assessment of the risks of spread of this disease through aerosol transmission, where people are gathered together, particularly where people are gathered together in an enclosed space. Now, to make a risk assessment of that, what you have to know is what the flow of fresh air is. Now, there is guidance about what clean air is, 10 cubic liters of fresh air per person per minute and so on. But what we lack is any guidance to employers as to how to carry out a risk assessment of what is required by way of ventilation, which will mitigate or remove the risk. I mean, just think for a moment about a school, the sort of school that I went to, windows that open, a closed door in the middle of winter. How are the school governors or the head teacher or the teacher in charge of the classroom to calculate how many windows need to be open, what activities are being conducted by in that particular classroom in order to maintain a safe and risk-free environment? There is no guidance at all, so far as I can see, from the HSE. This seems to me to be a major failing. But I'll let others of my colleagues talk about the HSE in other aspects, if that's enough to be going on with, Cad.
Thanks very much for that, John, for the overview of our weak laws and regulations and how even they have been undermined in recent years, and how the HSE has failed to monitor and enforce those. I know there's questions in the chat for you already, but before we get to the questions, I'll move on to our next speaker, who is Phil James. Phil is edited the whole report together. John just mentioned the lack of regulation and enforcement. One of the areas that hasn't been used to any kind of capacity during this, other than by the unions themselves, is the voice of workers, and that's what Phil is going to cover now. So welcome, Phil.
Thank you, Caroline. I should say from the outset, I'm speaking on behalf of Professor David Waters. So Dave wrote the relevant chapter. Hopefully I will do justice to what he's written. I want to start by just taking us back in time. If we go back to at least the 19th century, what we find is a recognition that worker consultation and representation is an important means of identifying workplace risks and controlling them. Since the 1970s, that role of consultation and representation has received legal acknowledgement. So today, all employers have a duty to consult over health and safety matters. In addition, in unionised environments, unions can appoint safety representatives, as has been mentioned, and those representatives have various rights and powers, including in relation to consultation and the undertaking of inspections and investigations. So to some extent, the issue of consultation and representation is covered legally. Now we get a pandemic that involves new and serious risks to worker health, literally a matter of life and death. That would seem the perfect circumstance to remind and emphasize people of the role of workforce consultation and representation. Sadly, when we look at government guidance and when we look at HSE guidance, that importance of worker representation and consultation is simply not acknowledged. It is true, the HSE produced a lovely glossy booklet, 22 pages long, and I read out the title because it's quite interesting. It's talking to workers about preventing coronavirus. Well, you would think consultation and representation is important there. You look at the introduction and it says, yes, employers have a duty to consult. And it does mention the words safety representatives. Read on to the other 20 pages. There is no further mention of representation at all. There's no mention of the legal rights of safety reps. There's no mention of the legal duty employers have to consult with them. And there's no guidance on how to carry out consultation or how to engage with safety reps. In other words, what you see replicated in that booklet is what John has just been talking about, a complete downplaying of the law and the duties of employers. Now, I'll leave it to the people listening to engage in their own speculation as to why this situation exists. But in the report, what we suggest is it's very much a product of HSE bending to the political wind and simply not wishing to upset the boat with the government. If you want support for that view, it's very interesting. If you turn not to the UK guidelines on managing coronavirus, but to the guidelines produced by the Scottish and Welsh governments, you see a much stronger emphasis on worker representation. And of course, that emphasis is put forward against the backcloth of both governments having fair work agendas. I think I'll stop there, Carolyn. I think we can move on to something else. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Phil. Yes, the government's definitely got a blind spot on acknowledging the role of unions and workplace representatives in dealing with this pandemic, and look at how others do it abroad, even in Scotland and Wales, shows us that another way is possible. So thanks for reminding us of that. I'll move swiftly on. We're all being very good with timing. Our next speaker is Steve Toombs, and Steve is going to look at the issue of workplace oversight. So over to you, Steve.
So look, thanks, Cad. Thanks to the IER. I wrote the chapter with my friend and colleague David White, who's not here today. Phil went back to the 1900s. I'm going to go back to a Sunday night in May 2020, when Prime Minister Boris Johnson took to television, national television, to encourage workers in England to get back to work. And the next day went to the Commons and he announced that the HSE would be undertaking what he called spot checks to make workplaces COVID-19 secure. And alongside that, he said there'd be an additional £14 million funding for HSE to allow to do this. Typically for Johnson, the statement he made that day vacillated between bluster and bullshit. And by bullshit, we mean lies, of course. By this time in 2020, Tory governments have presided over 20 years of ceaseless political and fiscal attacks on the HSE and their local authority counterparts, rendering health and safety enforcement virtually toothless. So in the 10 years prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, HSE funding had been reduced significantly. It fell from 239 million in 2019 to 141 million in 1920, a fall of just under £100 million. And that puts the £14 million extra funding that Johnson offered into sharp perspective, of course. During that period, that 10-year period up to 2019-20, frontline staff in HSE, including all their inspectors, had declined by 28%. Some local authorities, who also enforce health and safety law, of course, during that period had no dedicated health and safety enforcement capacity at all. So given this decline in funding and personnel prior to the pandemic, it's hardly surprising during that 10-year period that every form of enforcement activity, inspections, investigations, notices, prosecutions, they were all in decline, in some cases precipitous decline, inspections plummeted. So this kind of downturn in health and safety enforcement over a longer term period is the context for understanding Johnson's claim, assertion that HSE was well placed to ensure that workplaces would be, quote, COVID-19 secure. So how has HSE fared in this task set for them by the Prime Minister? Well, the extra funding provided to HSE was allocated ostensibly, I say extra funding, the 14 million to make up the 100 million that had been taken away. This extra funding was allocated ostensibly to cover spot checks promised by government, which were to detect breaches of law relating to COVID exposure and transmission. So what were these spot checks? They had 3 stages. Stage 1 spot checks were telephone calls, scripted set of questions that lasted for about 15 minutes. Stage 2 spot checks, according to HSE, quote, were more detailed conversations delving into any areas of potential concerns arising from stage 1. So stage 1, 15 minutes from a script, any issues they're picked up apparently in a stage 2 phone call. Both of those phone calls, stage 1 and stage 2, are largely made not by HSE inspectors, not by HSE staff, but by outsourced private providers in call centres. A small proportion of stage 2 calls were then referred on to stage 3. Stage 3 was an on-site inspection, prompted, according to HSE, again, in their own words, if there were any outstanding concerns from the calls process. And it was only at this stage that enforcement action would be taken. So, in the 6 months to the end of September, there were, in total, 15,622 spot checks by phone undertaken, stage 1 and stage 2. Those 15,600 spot check phone calls led to just under 5,000 visits, inspections, 4,938. And in total, all of that inspection activity, the phone calls and then the 5,000 inspections, by the way, that's about half the amount of inspections HSE did the previous year in the same 6-month period, right? All that enforcement activity, or so inspectorial activity, led to 78 enforcement notices and no prosecutions. And to date, as we speak, and as far as I know, there's still been no prosecutions of employers for COVID-related breaches. That in itself is scandalous, but it's even more scandalous when we set it against 40,000 plus fines against members of the public for breaking COVID regulations. So in short and inclusion, if the COVID secure workplace exists or is going to exist, it will be secured not by Johnson's funding, nor by HSE spot checks, but by workers themselves. And we've heard many times from CAD, also from Andy earlier on, about how the pandemic has exposed previously hidden or ignored realities of our broken society. COVID-19 has certainly revealed the broken state of national and local safety and health regulation enforcement in this country. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Steve, and to Dave White, your co-author. The work that you've done in digging down in gathering the information that Andy McDonald said is very difficult to get, is very good. I know that you use freedom of information requests to get much of that material that's informed this report, so thanks very much for that work. I'm going to move on now to our final presentation, and that again is to Phil. See, Phil, as editor, you get to do twice as much. So Phil is going to look at the lessons that we've learned whilst doing this report and say what we might do for the future. So over to you, Phil.
Thank you again, Carolyn. Steve's presentation just now, like the presentations that preceded him, have revealed what can only be described as a highly disturbing picture about the performance of the HSE during the pandemic. In fact, it has to be said that if you review that performance, you end up having to conclude, I think, that there are major doubts about the HSE as a credible regulator. Now, that poor performance has not emerged out of nowhere, as Steve has pointed out. It's deeply embedded in long-standing problems about HSE resourcing, in the way in which HSE has approached its regulatory role, and also even this constitutional status of HSE. That status has effectively allowed HSE to be captured, if that's the right word, by government and the business interests that they're looking after. So I think I need to make a very important point in here. The attack or the criticism we're making is a criticism of HSE and its political masters. It is not a condemnation of HSE staff. It is not raising any query about the professionalism and commitment of HSE staff and particularly inspectors. The blame for what's happened has to be laid at the door of government, this government, and governments that have come before. More widely, I think we also need to note that the HSE's performance during the pandemic can't be divorced from the nature of the regulatory system it is overseeing and operationalizing. It is for that reason that when we get to the final chapter of the report, we put forward a series of recommendations which are aimed not only at improving the performance of the HSE as a regulator, but also more widely trying to create a regulatory framework for health and safety at work which better protects workers. Now, most fundamentally, as Carolyn has already pointed out, we have called for an urgent launch of a public inquiry to look at the whole field of health and safety regulation and how that should be developed for the future. Alongside that, we put forward a series of other proposals, which I won't list in detail now, but would say they cover four main areas. The first is quite obviously to improve the resources, the enforcement strategies, and the independence of the HSE. And I can't stress that point about independence enough. What is needed is an independent voice to regulate health and safety at work, not one that is at the beck and call of whichever government's in power at a particular moment. So first area, action in relation to the HSE. Second area is to look at the nature of the statutory duties imposed on employers and amend them to better address the protection of casualised workers, those in the gig economy, etc. Third area is to look at the issue of supply chain regulation and to address the situation where often the poor working conditions in small workplaces are being driven by the purchasing powers of big organisations. And the final area, and again, this is no surprise, is action to enhance the rights of trade unions and safety representatives, including the ability of them to bring enforcement action independent of HSE and greater protection for carrying out their roles. All in all, it's believed such a programme of reform will provide us with a much more effective regulatory system that gives workers the protection they deserve. Just to finish with one final point, I talk a lot about HSE independence and not being at the beck and call in government. Could I just, in case people aren't aware of it, point out that the new chair of the HSE is a former Conservative MP who was a minister in the Department of Work and Pensions during the 2010 coalition government, at the exact time that massive cuts were being imposed on the HSE. So the use of the word capture, I used earlier, I think is entirely appropriate. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Phil, for rounding this all up and saying, outlining what we're hoping to look at as we go into stage 2 of our project and the kind of issues we'll need to cover. Thanks to all our speakers for everything they've said today. I should point out again that, you know, that those who have spoken tonight are just a small representation of those who've been involved. Other people on in the project, and some of whom today are Professor Keith Ewan, Michael Ford, Rory O'Neill, who's here with us, Phil Taylor, who's here with us, Dave Walters, who couldn't join us, Andrew Watterson and David White. We had a question from a pre-prepared question, one that was sent in from a member of the press, and that said, can there ever be grounds for corporate manslaughter if workers die after they're employed did not follow COVID rules? Presumed it would be difficult to prove the infection was caught at work. That is one question which is similar to one that is aimed at John Hendy, which says, why is the law so inadequate and why do more employers and government and now the HSE not held to criminal convictions more often for failure to implement the legislation? And I will just throw a third one in before I go back to some of our speakers. Do the speakers have any good examples as to where the respective laws have been used to enforce COVID safe workplaces, or has it more been down to the direct trade union involvement, as has been the case with CWU and others? So there was 3. I'm sure our panel can see the questions. Does anyone want to add anything?
I was going to say something about corporate manslaughter, just to make the point that, you know, that act was brought in 2007 to deal with large and complex organisations. It's not dealt with any of those. There have been 26 convictions since that was brought in, none in the last 3 years, none against large complex organisations, none concerned with health, right? But we need a test case. And I think if you look at the way the laws, I mean, John knows better than me about this, but if you look at the way the law is written, gross breach, senior management, and the senior management test, on the kind of obvious foreseeable nature of the risk, seems to me this is ripe for a test case, right? The difficulty is proving where the infection took place. But if you have a worker in a place where there's a cluster, who is, for example, forced to work despite having said they've got an underlying health condition, it seems to me that there are those examples around. As in all of these cases, we need a test case, but I'll hand it over to John.
Thanks, Steve. I'm no expert on criminal law. I know that corporate manslaughter is said by the criminal practitioners to be a very difficult offence to prove, because you've got to find the directing mind of the company and so on. But I agree with you. There must be some cases around. I mean, I'd certainly want to have some criminal experts having a look at what's happening at the DVLA in Swansea, where there've been protests and threatened industrial action because of the number of cases that have broken out with people compelled to work in circumstances where the union says that a lot of that work could be done at home. I think they got over 350 cases or something of that order, or is it 530 cases? I can't remember. But the question that was asked of me was, why aren't there more prosecutions? And the answer is really twofold. One is that the HSE has been starved of resources, as Phil has explained, over the last well, really over the last 50 years, it's been denied, its funds have been cut, but particularly over the last 10 years rather, its resources have been cut, and that means less inspectors with time to take prosecutions, because taking prosecutions is obviously expensive for the organization. So that's one reason, and the other is lack of political will, which has been which is, as Phil explained, is not the fault of the inspectors, but it is the fault of those that administer the HSE and the political powers that have put pressure on it.
Phil Taylor, I wondered if you wanted to say something about the outbreaks in some of these places and how we respond to them all.
Yeah, thank you. A very good question. I can think of several examples over the course of 2020 where there were acute outbreaks, very serious outbreaks, and it wasn't the legislation and it wasn't the HSE's intervention that ensured that workers ultimately were made safe. Effectively, it was union action that did it, whether that be in some cases walkouts, but certainly in other cases where union rep and official intervention ensured that home work was ensured. But I want to just highlight, because the question of the DVLA has come up. I mean, this is a national scandal. I mean, let's not mess about here. This is not a Welsh issue. This is a national issue of huge importance. The figures I understand it, John, is 562 cases since March, 8 up until September. So the rest come until the end of the year. Now, I do know that public health, the local authority, and also the HSE did pay a visit, paid more than one visit, but remember, this is in the context of hundreds and hundreds of positive cases, visited the DVLA just before Christmas. And the verdict was that the DVLA was doing the best it could under challenging circumstances. And the outcome, the workers were still compelled to come to work. I mean, and when it's mentioned before, when Phil mentioned about this being an occupational and a public health issue, you got no clearer example of this. The worst outbreak, a workplace outbreak that we can think, I think Janet went through this as well in the UK. And what's the outcome? The outcome is that the building still continues to remain open. So you ask yourself, John, absolutely right, what the hell has the HSE been doing around this? The first immediate precautionary principle should have been to close the bloody building down and send everybody home. Pardon my French. But this is a real, I mean, if this isn't serious as opposed to significant, I don't know what is.
Thanks, Phil. Rory, did you have anything to add on the role of the HSE and its leadership that you wanted to share with us?
The point that Phil made about HSE leadership rather than HSE inspectors is important for a couple of reasons. One, HSE was supposed to notionally have this idea of union side chair, employer side chair, and that happened to an extent. We had two union side chairs over history, both called Bill Sears and Bill Lawrence. Recently, we've had a whole sequence, 3 consecutive employer side chairs, and then topped it off with a government minister in the chair. So there's been a drift in the whole purpose of the regulation, the constitution of how HSE works, to make it not a tripartite body, because they've also stacked the board, which used to be tripartite with employer reps, but change it into an agent of government. Now we've seen that most clearly in this pandemic. It's not that HSE was instructed by government, it's that HSE didn't have to be. It was pre-complicit. It had already stepped back. It's told us in Freedom of Information requests that the COVID outbreak is not a health and safety issue. It is a public health issue. That's like saying that falls from heights are an issue for mountain rescue, not for HSE, when people fall off a scaffold. It's ludicrous. It's abrogating its responsibility before we start. It's not judging things on a case-by-case basis or an issue basis. So we've lost our representation in the workplace. And when it comes to the point made about inspections and if they're effective, well, we're not really having inspections. Those numbers are mythical. What we've got are subcontracted debt collectors going into the workplace with a checkbox and saying, well, I don't see anything wrong here. Well, it's no wonder no one owed any money. They didn't know what they're looking for. So that is what we're seeing at the moment. We're not seeing inspections, we're not seeing enforcement, and we're seeing an enforcement agency that is pre-capitulated. It's gone. We don't have an HSE anymore, which is why the public inquiry is absolutely urgent, because we've lost Robans. It's not there anymore. It's history. We need a new Robans and a new era.
Could you say a little bit more about risk assessments and enforced home working?
What do I say? I mean, actually, Phil Taylor, of course, has been doing some major work around home working. I mean, the basic point to make about home working is people are at work, which means that the legal duties employers have apply equally to them, whether they're working at home or not, which means, in theory, that there should be a process of risk assessment. And any problems identified by risk assessment should be addressed by the employer. Phil Taylor can probably tell you what he's found in the survey, but my impression is very much that the number of employers who are systematically undertaking risk assessments in relation to home working are a small minority. And certainly the number who are undertaking risk assessments that are broadly based and including things like the interface between working life and life more generally will be a very, very, very small minority. But perhaps Phil Taylor can just give us a flavour of what he's found from the survey.
There's a question here from Daniel Tibaldi, who is from an Italian news outlet, and I think his question highlights the difference of approaches that we see across Europe. He says he understands workers have little influence over the HSE and understands that UK is common law jurisdiction. To what extent do workers have influence over the common law by representing their own cases? I know this was touched on. Are they allowed an independent judicial system through juries, for instance, as compared with an HSE, which appears to lack independence?
In theory, if we move attention to the criminal law and the Health and Safety at Work Act, I mean, there is a possibility in principle of a private prosecution being brought. But permission has to be granted for such a prosecution. And as far as I'm aware, no such permission's ever been granted. I could be wrong.
I think from responding to someone from outside the UK, I think certainly someone from mainland Europe, I think what is a distinguishing feature of our system, which I think is very important, is the lack of agency which workers have, the lack of control which they have either personally or through their organizations to take steps to protect their health and safety. So, you know, we heard from John about the failure or the inability of workers personally to enforce rights under the legislation, so in a sense all being passed on to the agencies. Secondly, we have a chronic problem in this country of the retreat of collective bargaining and the role and presence of trade unions in workplaces in a way, I think, which is probably quite unprecedented elsewhere in major European countries. And I think thirdly, as a consequence of 1 and 2, a third problem is the lack of any power of workers or their organizations to stop the job, or effectively to stop what are dangerous work practices. So in a sense, it comes back to some of the points that were made at the start. That's what we have is a serious structural failure of our labour law, which is being played out at the moment through these health and safety concerns. And I'd have thought, one issue, which relates to that is the need to beef up sections 44 and 100. But I think the weakness of 44 and 100 are simply a symptom of much deeper structural failures of our labour law system, which I think the pamphlet has brilliantly exposed.
Thanks for that, Keith. And someone is saying in the chat that the PCS ballot on taking action at the DVLA closes today, so we can keep our eye open and see what happens with that one. Rory.
Thank you, Carolyn. One thing I think really needs addressing is the notion that we have a right to refuse and protection from victimisation. Well, we have a duty to refuse dangerous work, you'd say, under Section 7 of the Health and Safety at Work Act. But our protections under Section 44 and Section 100 of the Employment Acts are not defensible by HSE and are only after the fact protections. In other words, you can be victimised and then complain about it. That's not protection. That's something that's a price many bad employers are willing to pay. Get rid of a troublemaker who's organised around health and safety, and then paying the cost if they can afford to go through the tribunal hurdles, jump over the barriers and pay the price when they get there. It's just too many barriers to justice and too many barriers to whistleblowing. So we need a direct right. And you would bear in mind that in the US, they have a specific victimization law, which is covered by the enforcement agency OSHA. It's actually something where the inspectors act on it and prosecute on it, which we don't have here. And workers there and unions there complain that that is grossly inadequate. So we've not even got what's bad in the US.
What we've done, I think, on today and in the report is expose the many problems in our health and safety laws and regulations, something that we'll be picking up to see if we run a committee of inquiry into how we change the whole framework of law. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Sarah and James for operating behind the scenes, and we hope to see you all soon.